And I really would like to encourage you, if you have any topics regarding your expectations to the summer school, any critiques, feedbacks, or if you have personal problems or whatever, please don't hesitate to approach us and let us know, and we'll try to deal with it and see if we can change the agenda a little bit, or if you want to have shorter breaks, maybe, I don't know, just let us know whatever you think about the whole thing and how are you doing. So really don't be afraid of approaching anyone here, and we'll try to deal with it. So that's it from my side. I would like to ask the speakers for the...
Yeah. Question, will there be a short explanation of the content of the 4 discussion groups so that people can easily
Yes, yeah.
decide?
So regarding how we split in the 4 discussion groups, it will be 4 groups. Basically, you can choose freely. An explanation for the respective topics will follow by my colleague. So I don't want to say too much about it. I think it's not my task and my expertise to do so. So I may ask the speakers to the panel. I don't know how, if you do it together or if you split up in one-on-one.
David, come. We have 4 speakers this morning. Each of them will take about 10 to 15 minutes to introduce their topic. The first one will be myself. We'll talk about the regionalization of development in the Mekong region in general. Then it will follow by Daniel Havert, who's standing over there. He is working on the project on land governance at RCSD, Faculty of Social Science, Chiang University. He will cover about land use, land grabbing in the Greater Mekong sub-region. Then Carl Middleton, can you come up here? Carl will talk about transboundary environmental justice. And David will talk about transboundary water management. David is a lecturer at Department of Social Science and Development at Faculty of Social Science at Chiang University. And the last one, I will talk briefly about that will be 4 of us. Then we'll break up into 4 groups. You can choose freely on the topic that you are interested in, either on land issues, water management issue, or environmental justice. And the last one is on refugees. I will not cover the content on refugees in my introductory talk, but I'll give more details in the group discussion that will take place after the coffee break this morning. Okay. So you are more or less familiar with the concept of area study, which briefly was discussed yesterday by Professor Antweiler. I will not cover the whole Southeast Asian region, but we'll focus mainly on the mainland Southeast Asia, or sometimes it's called the upper mainland Southeast Asia, meaning the countries such as Myanmar, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam. The area has been conceptualized and reconceptualized different times. Before World War II, or even after that, the upper part of this area was called the Golden Triangle, famous for opium cultivation and drug. Later, it was called Greater Mekong sub-region in the early 1990s. And 2005, 2015, in the last 2000, we refer to this area as Upper ASEAN or ASEAN country. A brief sketch on the historical chronological orders of this is maybe interesting, but I will not go through all of this, but would like to point out that during 1960 and 1970, there were many refugees coming from Vietnam, Cambodia into Thai border. Of course, there are also other migrants. At that time, we do not call them refugees, come from the western part of Thailand, from Burma, and from southern part of China. What is also interesting that it was 1996 when Vietnam and Laos became, Vietnam adopted the policy of Doi Mới, and Laos adopted the new economic mechanism, wanted to change what they call landlocked country to land-linked country, and they wish to become the battery of Asia. Well, also interesting is around that same time, growing ethnic conflict in Myanmar. And the end of 1980s, Thailand has adopted the policy of changing the battlefield to marketplace, and followed by 1990s, when there is an emergence of what is called the Greater Mekong Sub-region, supported by ADB. I'll talk about ADB later. And during that time, there has been an expansion of civil society in Thailand and the Mekong Sub-region, but later this expansion of the civil society has been much reduced, particularly in the year 2000. We have the interesting event, that is the China's Southward movement. They developed water channel and road, building dams, and adopted the One Belt, One Road policy. And then in year 2014, Thailand democratic government has been seized, and the country become under the military regime until today. At the same time, in Myanmar, there has been an attempt to reach peace process, and at the same time, you observed another very terrible incident, which is called the Rohingya crisis, and why the ASEAN community was celebrating the solidarity among the members of the community. I have been observing what I would call regionalization of development, or regional integration, if you will, and try to understand the rationale behind that. And it's quite clear that these attempt to consolidate or to integrate the region is coming from the ideas that they want to create what they call the single market. The ideas of creating a single market, single production base. The motive behind that is they think that these market from this country with these markets include those next door with neighboring countries. Peace in the sub-region has encouraged the natural process of economic integration, including cross-border trade, investment, labor mobility. What is important is that they consider, or they would like to see competitiveness among the 6 Mekong countries. So to be competitive, these 6 Mekong countries must develop their natural resource efficiently. Sub-regional economic cooperation facilitate this. So the idea is to connect all these what we call ASEAN connectivity, emphasize upon the three types of connectivity: physical connectivity, institutional connectivity, people-to-people connectivity. So what does it mean is that the idea to create competitive single market is to allow free flow of goods, free flows of services, free flow of investment, flows of capital, and also flow of skilled labor. So the strategy that have adopted is to first to resolve what they call the development divide. The countries Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Vietnam are considered to be lag behind Malaysia, Singapore, Brunei, the Philippines, Indonesia, and Thailand. So they want to reduce the difference between those who come later and those who have gone far further. They respect and keep diversity in the political, security, and socio-cultural pillars. So that's why ASEAN adopted the policy of constructive engagement. Do exchange more trades, working together for economic development, but do not interfere with political situation or political issues in each country. But the main agenda is for economic unity, single market. Protection and promoting of material and ideological interests of private sector, private property, private profit at the expense of the public welfare and social values of the commons. This is what I would say that I see ASEAN community as a different from ADB or different from the state policy. I would call this like we would like to see ASEAN from below. Look at who benefit from this connectivity and single market. So you have this high demand for energy. High demand for energy, dams has been built. So Carl would talk about dam building, but I just want to show that here we can see that there are many dams being built, and also on the lower part you can see that Thailand draw a lot of gas and natural gas from Myanmar to feed the demand of Bangkok. Gas pipeline has been built. And this is one of the reasons why many people who live along the pipelines have been displaced and joined the refugee camp in Thailand. On the upper part, you can see that gas and oil pipeline has been built from Sittwe, from Bengal, Gulf of Bengal, to Kunming, to China. Gas pipeline has been completed. So China relied upon gas and energy from Myanmar. I will skip this very quickly. These are the plans to build dam. Next year, Sayaburi Dam, which has been built by Thai company and supported by 5 commercial banks in Thailand, will be completed. And now they are talking about new dam, Pak Bang and Pak Lai, to be this should be in the pipeline, and we are now negotiating it. And Don Sahong Dam is being under construction, and a few more. Okay. So there is an issue of what happened to this development. If we build dams, it will be connect this country through the highways. What about local people, local economy? Okay. What about the ecosystem? More than that, there is also extractive industry, like oil and gas, as I mentioned, heavy fishing, commercial fishing in the Gulf of Thailand, including the South China Sea. A lot of mining going on, like gold mine, potash mine in northeast of Thailand, copper mine in Burma, coal in Laos, in Burma, limestone in Burma, jade in northern part of Burma. And of course, extractive agriculture. Rubber, banana, you see in the future. Maize is a big issue now in northern Thailand and northern Burma. Sugar cane, okay, all of this. And of course, follow that, they want to develop special economic zone, not only in Myanmar, but also in Thailand, Laos, all of this. So China become Myanmar's top source of FDI, for example. So we also have seen this land grabbing in Cambodia. These are the maps which show the place where land has been given concession to Thai sugar company to grow sugar cane, not only for a few years, but for 60 years. So here you have this also, these different types of migration occur in this region. Migrant workers in Thailand, there must be at least about 6 million migrant Burma. Yeah? Both illegal and legal. Yes. You'll talk about this later. But and that's cross-border. But in international migration, migrant workers from Burma also go to work in Malaysia, Singapore, not only in Thailand. Thai workers going to Korea, Hong Kong, not so much in Brunei now, not before they went to the Middle East, but now they are in Korea, Japan, Hong Kong, Brunei. They also, our colleagues from Vietnam can tell us more. Migrant workers from Vietnam go to work in, not only in Thailand, but in China, in the cash crop production there. In Thailand, you have observed a high degree of medical tourism. These include long stay tourists in Chiang Mai, in Chonburi, and other places. And of course, Chinese tourists flock to Thailand and Pattaya and Phuket. Last week, there was a big news about the capsize of the 2 boats in Phuket, and 47 of them died. And there are lots of details about that, but here Thailand is expecting to see more, to receive more tourists from China. They expect to have about 10 million Chinese tourists per year. And of course, Chinese traders, Chinese workers in Vientiane, in Myanmar, a lot of them in Myanmar. And that's also lead to other issues like land grabbing. Right? And of course, in Thailand, you have another phenomenon called transnational marriage. So these are some of phenomena that I observe. And so the question for me is whether these ASEAN connectivity, when we talk about regional development, regional integration, or regionalization of development, there are some people who are included. Most of them are the elite. Most of them are the companies. But there are also those who are excluded. So the issue of inclusion, exclusion cannot be forgotten when we talk about regional integration or regional development. We also need to talk about the issue of issue of values and the issue of the commons. Whether we prefer the sustainable livelihood of the local people who depends upon fish and ecosystem in the river, or we prefer dams and electricities. So value issue. Of course, when we talk about this regional integration, there are some people who are integrated living in the big cities, but many people are still living in the marginal areas, become stateless people. There are still many stateless people in Thailand. Ethnic minorities in Thailand, maybe about 200,000 of them have not been given citizenship yet. And of course, there's still conflict, ethnic conflict. in Burma and in southern part of Thailand. They have not been integrated into our ASEAN community. There have been a discussion about ASEAN citizens, but so far, nothing concretely can happen. That's the big issue. So when we talk about this globalization, ASEAN connectivity, or seamless connectivities, there are still people who are not recognized. There are still people who are unaccepted to be part of the growing economy and the growing society. So this is what I would like to leave it here. And then I will invite my colleagues here to speak on the topic of their own specialization. So you first or you? Okay.
Okay, thank you very much, Ajahn Chan, for I think this is a very good entry point into a lot of different issues involving regionalization around the Mekong region. And in this next presentation, I want to start focusing down towards the more specified topic of land. And I think you'll see as we go along that there are many features which will overlap. Now, I will be presenting further on land on Friday, so this will be more pointed. Actually, I have to be honest with you, I've kind of stolen this presentation. Jean-Christophe Dipa, a Cambodian scholar, or a scholar living in Cambodia, has done some fantastic work for the Mekong Region Land Governance Project, looking at how land investments are circulating around the region and how the dynamics around these investments. So he's kindly let me borrow elements of his presentation to show to you today, because I think he really collects information in a very interesting and clear way, better than I ever could. So I want to start with a slide looking at the rise again of large agricultural plantations. Now, the word again is used in reference to the fact that you can think of a first generation of plantation from colonial times. But if you look at these four country diagrams, and these will be the main countries of focus, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and Vietnam, you'll see that there has been there's a consistency in increase within a certain time period. And that time period is roughly around 2006 to 2012. And if you think about that time period, this is the moment when food prices went up, when we had the economic downturn, the global economic downturn, and also, sort of as another result, we could say the phenomenon of land grabbing came forward. So as food prices went up, you could see there's an international reaction to how are you going to access cheap land to grow or provide your resources. This isn't just about agriculture, this extends into extractive industries, other land-based industries. But I think for today, the focus will be more on the use of agricultural land. So, taking that into account, Jean-Christophe made this very interesting map looking at the traveling of investment around the region. And as far as I know, this is covering a similar sort of period between 2006-07 to 2015, I think. What we can see is there's a lot of investment flowing into three countries in the region, namely Myanmar, Laos, and Cambodia. And a lot of investment leaving, or countries of investment being Thailand, China, and Vietnam. Now, Vietnam is a more particular case that I want to focus more on Cambodia and Laos here. You will see on the pie charts on the left that there is still inevitably a high investment rate for domestic land investment, but I find it's still quite staggering, the amount of investment in land from other countries. Particularly in China, moving into Laos, Vietnam into Laos at a very high level. The arrows represent the size of the arrow will represent the amount of investment. And in the case of Myanmar, getting clear data is less clear, so we have a dotted arrow. But we can certainly speculate that it will be similar amounts as, say, to Laos. Now, we can see this regionalization of investment into land in a certain direction. If we then compare that to a directionality of commodities being produced and transported between countries, we see some interesting points of comparison. Purely in terms of the land-based investment charts, we do generally see a reversal of these arrows. So we see commodities traveling back from Laos and Cambodia to China, to Thailand, from Laos and Myanmar, from Laos to Vietnam. We see that reversal. We do also see a very large arrow going from Thailand to China. I'll just use this as an example that the case of Thailand is different in that when we think of investment in land, often the way that's been manifested is through land concessions, whereby a state will acquire or expropriate plots of land and then will put that under a leasehold to give to foreign investors, which can be anything from under 50 years to 100 years plus. Now, in the case of Thailand, Thailand has managed to avoid this process of the creation of large plantations, large concessions. There's a long historical political reasoning for this, but actually, if you look into the agricultural system in Thailand, there's a kind of a legacy of smallholder farming, whereby land is pretty much staying within the control of its people. This is a general statement. So what we can actually see is that even though there's a large directionality of commodities from Thailand going to China, this is actually coming out of a smallholder agricultural system. Now, but generally what we can see is this direction. I've put there's comment at the top: extraterritorial control of land to secure access access to scarce resources. So it is this: countries are looking outside their boundaries. Where can we find land? Where can we find cheap land? Where can we find land that we can control under very loose regulatory control? And these are certainly countries where you found this have been places like Laos, Cambodia, and Myanmar. Let's see, going okay for time. Another interesting perspective is to see where, a bit more precisely, where are such land concessions being held. Now, and there's two elements to this diagram. You can see, if you look at all the red dots, these represent border economic zones. Naturally, you find them on the borders between countries. The logical thing to do is to source land close to you. So even though it's across borders, you find it on the border from just inside the border in northern Laos. And then it's easy to transport back to China, one example. Vietnam, just on the border of eastern Laos. There's another element, which is being special economic zones, where actually you see this ties in a little more to GMS corridors. Now, I think Ajahn Chah, I suddenly saw a slide within his presentation which was looking at the economic corridors, whereby there's been a concerted effort in the region to build up more developed transport infrastructure to try and free up a series of kind of geographical economic corridors, whether it's going from, there's an eastern corridor, a southern corridor, a northern corridor. And what you can see is that some of the blue dots are often located precisely on these transport links. So it's not just about, this very much shows how land is strategically being sourced to cater to your country needs, but taking advantage of these growing infrastructural lines around the region. And in fact, what John Christoph has done some very interesting work to start looking at what are the a bit more precisely, what are the type of concessions, where are they being grouped. And so he's actually identified different investment clusters. For example, number 3 and 4 really emphasizes China kind of monopolizing land in northern Laos, be it in rubber or bananas. You also have number 1, where China is cultivating land for rubber in Myanmar. Number 6 relates to the earlier comment from Ajahn Chah of Thailand finding land in Cambodia for sugarcane production. Thailand also with rubber in Myanmar, but this time in the south of the country. So, to start bringing to a conclusion, I think it's very interesting what Ajahn Chah says about thinking in terms of inclusions and exclusions. What we have here is an attempt through free trade agreements, through kind of state-level regulations to free up land, to, as they call it in Laos, turning land into capital, including your land into regional markets, making them available for different countries to acquire and use for extraction, for cultivation. That's the inclusion side. There are different impacts as a result. In terms of exclusion, the big question and the big fear has been, this is all fine, increasing markets. Theoretically, it may be beneficial to the national development of your country, to your GDP, but what about the smallholder farmer? What about the people who are being displaced for dams, for land concessions, for special economic zones? So often, one person's inclusion will result in another person's exclusion. And I think it's a very important form of critical thinking, always to consider both sides of this coin. As other kinds of impacts, creating all these land concessions has resulted in extensive deforestation, especially in Cambodia and Myanmar. When you actually look at how these concessions have been working, often the efficiency of land use has been terrible, to be honest. There are many concessions in Cambodia and Myanmar where only 20% of the land provided gets developed. Often the economic returns have been actually quite poor. So, actually, and then, this is nice, I'll go back to the first slide. So, since about 2011 and 12, there has been a lot of questions raised about the efficiency and the productivity of these large plantations, of these international land concessions, particularly at the level for countries who are providing the land. So if you look past the arrows, you will see that generally the amount of land being given out for plantations is either stabilized or gone down. In the case of Myanmar and Cambodia, actually moratoriums against concessions were put in place. So I leave you with this quandary that's going on at the moment. Does this mean people are now turning away from these kind of big land investments? It's a possible theory. And so in that case, what will replace it? And maybe you leaving with a hopeful message. Perhaps this is opening up new possible spaces, new possible channels to promote different types of land investments, which actually may be more inclusive, not just at national level, but also to local land users. Perhaps. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hey, good morning, everyone. My name is Carl. I teach on the MAIDS program at Chulalongkorn University. I'm sorry I couldn't be here yesterday. So I'm very happy to join this panel, and I hope this presentation will contribute to the two presentations first, and also David's afterwards. So what I want to talk about today is transboundary environmental injustice, and what I will present about is sort of twofold. One is, what is the idea of this? And then the second is, how could it relate to your research? So how can we understand the issue of transboundary environmental injustice in mainland Southeast Asia? And in particular, how could you as researchers, or students and researchers, research this topic and incorporate it into your own work? Maybe some of you are already familiar with the concept of environmental injustice. My idea, I think, is first I will just introduce the idea, and then after that I will talk about the sort of transboundary dimension, and then after that I will give you one brief case study that will build upon the land example. And then if you join the session afterwards, after the coffee break, we will talk about water and dam projects. So in essence, environmental justice calls for the fair sharing of harms and benefits in terms of people's relationship with the environment. I'm going to go into a bit more detail in a second. I'll just introduce it first. Environmental injustice can occur within one nation state, it can occur very locally, or it can occur in a transnational sense as well. And when we talk about the transnational sense, it could be maybe related to what Daniel's describing, that investors come in and do a land grab, and then commodities are exported. Or it could be in a sense of a project that's developed in one country that creates impacts on another country. So maybe you've heard of the idea of climate injustice and the climate justice movement. So, I mean, clearly the people who are experiencing the impacts of climate change are mostly not the ones that have been responsible for the majority of its creation. So this is a global issue, right? So it's transboundary in that sense. So there's a long history that I won't go into now, but if we can talk about it after the break if you're interested. So it has its origins actually in the US as a social movement. So we can see the environmental justice as an idea both as a social movement as well as a sort of a way of researching things and looking at things. So a famous book by Robert Bullard, Dumping in Dixie, looked at environmental injustice in US, also called environmental racism, because it looked at how Black and Hispanic communities were often the victims of environmentally harmful projects. And what the book revealed was what the social movement revealed was how these projects were actually institutionalized. It wasn't by chance that these projects ended up in marginalized communities. It was actually an institutionalized arrangement within the government's decision-making process. Moving to Southeast Asia, so maybe an example of a domestic environmental injustice, relatively nearby to Chiang Mai, like Metmore coal-fired power station, that has created harms for local communities in terms of their health and access to resources. Some transboundary examples, Ajahn Chhan already mentioned Xayaburi Dam. So this is a project that both creates harms locally, but also being built on a transnational river also can create harms across borders. A final example, just to get your mind into what we might be thinking about here. Recently in the news, Thailand there's been attention being paid to e-waste being dumped in Thailand. So Europe, the US, and other economically wealthy regions have been sending their trash with illegal documents to Thailand to be disposed of in a rather dubious way. Some companies don't even have the equipment to dispose of this stuff, they're just burning it. So, I mean, this is an example of a sort of transnational environmental injustice where the product and production of one region is kind of disposed of in another, which is not in the position to be able to deal with this type of trash, and creates harms on local communities in a place far distant from where the benefits of the consumption have taken place. So this broadly is the sort of themes that we could address in the idea of environmental injustice. Analytically speaking, how could we think about this? So 3 broad ideas that are often used: distributive, procedural, and recognitional injustices. So distributive injustice basically refers to who wins and who loses when it comes to the distribution of environmental harms, risks, and benefits. And I mean, there are many different ways of talking about distribution as fair or not. It could be egalitarian, i.e. everybody is entitled to an equal share. It could be proportional to contribution. Those that contribute more can have more benefits. Or it could be based on distribution and need, i.e. those that need more, maybe like they're hungry, for example, should be entitled to a greater proportion of whatever's being distributed. So this is distributional justice. Procedural justice talks about the way that decisions are taken and who is included and who is excluded. And who has power within these decision-making processes, who is heard. So this is the idea of procedural justice. And then there's justice as recognition. Sometimes something is not recognized as an injustice. So, for example, discrimination based on gender or ethnicity. These can be very culturally embedded. So rendering visible the injustices that take place has also been an important part of the work of the environmental justice movement. And so maybe 50 years from now, the way that we treat like mammals, like maybe apes, already this is a big discussion, like should they have the equivalent of human rights? 50 years from now, maybe it would be unimaginable for them not to, but at the moment this is still a part of a big debate. Yeah? Okay, so this is justice as recognition. So I just want to sort of briefly introduce these ideas now. But essentially, this is sort of an analytical way of thinking about the way that we can look at justice in the case of particular projects or development pathways, such as like regionalization, as Ajahn Chiang outlined, mapped out. I'll introduce a bit more sort of analytical ideas. So we need to differentiate between, in terms of thinking about injustice, the difference between inequality and injustice. In other words, something can be uneven, but it's not necessarily an injustice until we make a judgment on it. Right? So environmental inequality is a descriptive term that describes a difference or unevenness between different groups of people. So I know I'm going a little bit fast, but these are just to introduce some ideas. So some things can be different, like income, health, the creation of pollution or the exposure of pollution, who has access to resources. Like different people within a society or within a group will have different levels of these types of things. But when we start looking for injustices, we might ask how these things are distributed differently between different groups within a place, within a locality. So for example, are there differences between the old and the young, between the rich and the poor, between ethnic groups, between gender, between countries? Right? So the first step in understanding about these ways of looking at environmental injustice is to look at what is being distributed and who can access them and who cannot, and to identify whether there are different groupings that are benefiting differently. But this is not necessarily an injustice yet. The question is, when something is being distributed, is it considered to be fair or not? So this is where a normative dimension comes in. i.e., is it under a market economy, economic inequality is actually considered okay, right? It's actually considered a meritocracy-based idea, right? That those that work hard are the ones that can have more income. We kind of know that's not true, right? But in the prevailing norm of the market economy, that's the idea. So in other words, society as a whole is willing to accept these inequalities because there's a norm prevailing that this is what happens in a market economy, and if you just work a bit harder and you find your $1 million idea, then you too can be successful in that sense. So what I'm trying to say here is that when we think about environmental injustice, or injustice in general, we look at distributions or we look at decision-making processes, and then there's a normative judgment by a group as to whether it's unfair or not. We have to separate them out when we're trying to analyze them. And obviously, we are a diverse group within societies, so not everybody's going to agree. One person's justice is going to be another person's injustice. So then we move into the realm of politics. Like, how do these things work their way out? So just keeping it simple for now, like, we can think at the idea of claim making, i.e. the way that different groups who perceive something as just or unjust represent their case. So thinking about what I've just said, that different groups, if you think about a debate in the newspaper or a contestation over something like a dam or a land grab, some groups will try and justify why it's okay to be the way that it is, and other groups will say, no, this is unfair. And so what we could start looking at is the way that these politics play out, and one idea that we can use is the idea of claim making. And so a claim making is essentially, a simplified way for this, for analyzing, would be what evidence is put forward and how is it judged, okay? So what is the evidence of the inequality and what's the normative position on whether it's just or unjust? So just to take one example, this is an opinion piece from the Bangkok Post, an article, I think. Just to sort of give you a sense, like how could you unpack people's narratives or claims? So this is about the Xayaburi Dam and how one community says that the project is unfair. So this is from the text. The villagers assert, or the villagers claim, that the Xayaburi will cause profound ecological damage to the Mekong's ecosystems and harm repairing communities. So they put forward some evidence of how they think things are going to happen. They claim that the defendants, so this is related to a court case against the project proponents, they claim that the defendants, such as the State Electricity Generating Authority of Thailand, and 4 other state agencies approved and signed the power purchase agreement whilst failing to ensure people's rights were protected under the 2007 Constitution. So they make an assertion that there's been a process of procedural injustice here. And then they make a normative claim. Under the constitutions, communities have a right to be informed and participate in any project or activity carried out by state officials. So obviously this is the previous constitution now, but they're basically saying this is unjust because the framework of the constitution was not followed. So this is how you can see a sort of claim-making process between the evidence and the injustice. So in a paper that a book chapter that I did a couple of years ago, the way that I started thinking about this is how do these environmental injustice debates in the region play out in different arenas? And this is where I think it kind of links to the regionalization theme, because especially in the context that's been described by Ajahn Chayan and Daniel of like flows of investment, flows of commodities across borders, movements of people, the economy is increasingly integrated in Southeast Asia. But does that mean that access to justice is becoming integrated across borders? How do you see access to justice and dealing with environmental injustice being dealt with when the investment and maybe the market is in one country, but the actual impacts are in another? There's kind of there's a lot of differences between the different countries in terms of their access to justice, their justice systems. We could say that there's kind of uneven access to justice. So I started looking for arenas of justice. Where do different groups pursue justice? And I consider these arenas of justice as politicized spaces of governance in which a process for claiming and or defending rights, in this case to land, or seeking redress for rights from violations take place. And I could see them across scales. So ranging from very local places, like within the family, or within the community, within the village, to national level, like national justice systems, to regional intergovernmental systems, like the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights, to international intergovernmental systems, like the UN Human Rights Council, to voluntary mechanisms, like for corporate accountability or corporate social responsibility. These are ideals. Clearly, many of them have shortcomings, but they're also, in terms of a way of seeking justice, they are opportunities as well. and it's not just the formal arenas. I'm not just saying these are formal processes, but actually many of the politics that take place are the informal arenas around them. So for example, when a court case takes place, it's as important how the media is reporting the court case that places focus on the courts as it is as to what happens in the courtroom itself. Another brief idea is the idea of legal pluralism. Let's not just focus upon the idea that justice is the law, because the law can be unjust, as I think we're all well aware working in Southeast Asia. So then the question is, like, what norms come into play if we're talking not just about fairness as the law, but also fairness in terms of other norms? We could use the idea of sort of legal pluralism or justice pluralism, where justice as a concept is situational, plural, and political. So on the one hand, you could have human rights-based claims, but then you could also have what we might call like cultural-based claims, like other practices, which some groups may consider just and others would consider unjust. So maybe relating to Daniel's example, like how to deal with claims based around customary land tenure when it comes up against state-backed businesses doing a big land grab. Like if the community bases a claim on, but this is our customary land, but the state says, aha, but this is the law, and we have the right to take the land and give it to this company, whose justice is the true justice? Or, I mean, really it relates to power relations and who can claim stronger. So in the case of environmental justice, it's worth just noting that there is an increasing international recognition of the universal right to a clean, healthy, and safe environment. It's included in the ASEAN Human Rights Declaration. It's also included, increasingly recognized as a UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights. But at the same time, there's also a lot of really interesting work looking at how justice is situational. So for example, John Barras and Jennifer Franco published a book. I mean, there's a lot of work being done on this, on the concept of land sovereignty. And so that really bases the idea of land norms around the places where land is situated. So then one sort of final concept to bring in is the idea of extraterritorial obligations. So actually in Daniel's slide, he talked just briefly about sort of governing land extraterritorially. And I think we'll discuss this in the political ecology session in the afternoon as well. Extraterritorial obligations are the idea that if actors, mainly businesses from one state, create an injustice in another place and communities cannot access justice in that second state, then the first state has a responsibility to also help the affected people seek justice. And we can discuss this, for those interested, we can discuss this after the break, but there's a growing number of cases where the national human rights institutions in Thailand, in Malaysia in particular, have started accepting cases of cross-border investment. So the Thai National Human Rights Commission has accepted cases like the Xayaburi Dam, the Dawei Special Economic Zone, whilst the Malaysian National Human Rights Commission has accepted the Don Sahong case, or investigated it but concluded it already. So one very brief example, this should talk well to Daniel's case, the Kokon sugarcane concession. So this is a Thai company that has invested with a local senator, powerful senator, in a land concession in Cambodia. And the Cambodian government approved a large sugarcane concession in 2006 that dispossessed 450 households of land that they used for upland agriculture. There was no consultation, the process of dispossession was at times violent, and the actual clearing of their land was even initiated before the concession contract was signed. So there have been studies that have shown a whole range of impacts on the community, including reduced income, food insecurity, increased debt. I won't go into these in details. What I want to show is how the communities, civil society groups use different avenues of local and transnational arenas of justice to try and deal with the case. So it ranged from direct protest at the site to trying to use the Cambodian court system, to communications with the companies. A case was brought to the Thai National Human Rights Commission. They even sought a court case in the UK because the sugar buyer via Khon Kaen Sugar Company was Tate & Lyle, which is a UK company. So in other words, in a regionally integrated region, economically speaking, civil society and communities are also trying to find these transnational spaces of justice with measured levels of success. But in the end, over 220 families have still not yet received like adequate compensation. And really, what they really want is their land back. So this is the Thai National Human Rights Commission in the landmark ruling. I mean, they don't have that much power, but they basically found that this was an unprecedented case, the first case where the Thai National Human Rights Commission looked at the practice of a Thai company in a neighboring country. And they said that they recognized that Khon Kaen Sugar Company is in part directly responsible for the impact on human rights violations. Then they made recommendations to the Thailand's Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Ministry of Commerce that led to Thailand becoming a proponent of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. So that's kind of a broad idea on how we might approach environmental injustice in a regional sense. To summarize, environmental justice calls for the fair sharing of harms and benefits in domestic and transnational circumstances. It entails access to national legal systems, regional mechanisms, government commitments to various freedoms, empowered communities, and a strong national civil society as watchdog. So I hope that contribution is useful. Thank you.
Thank you.
My part, I will take the responsibility of the transboundary rivers management in mainland Southeast Asia as well. And I will give the brief historical review of the transboundary river management in mainland Southeast Asia. And in the 1950s, I think that the hydropower dams creation in mainland Southeast Asia, that many people focus on these issues. Actually, these issues emerged in the 1950s. During that time is the rivalry between the West and the East. And the United Nations cooperate with the United States want to promote, create the hydropower dams in mainland Southeast Asia. So the reason is from the Western perspective, they believe that electricity at hydropower dam can provide irrigation and electricity to the people who live in Southeast Asia. And during that time, majority of the people are still living under the poverty. So they believe that if we can improve the living standard of these people, that these people can free from the communism influence or something. Okay. During that time, that the United Nations and United States creates the Mekong River Committee, but from the 1950 to the 1980, there's the several wars in mainland Southeast Asia, and also in Cambodia has the Pol Pot regime. So actually, the Mekong River Committee ceased during that time. But again, the kind of a concept of develop the river, transboundary rivers emerged in the late 1980s. That's just, and then Chiang mentioned that the Thai government promotes the concept, which is to turn battlefields into the marketplace in mainland Southeast Asia. And also in the 1990s, that the Asia Development Bank came to mainland Southeast Asia to promote the scheme of the Greater Mekong sub-region that focused on the creation of hydropower dams, the railways and highways. Okay. Let's see. It's very interesting because after the Asia Development Bank promotes the Greater Mekong sub-region, and there's several many scholars in the international relation realm predict, and also those scholars also study the Mekong rivers in China, creation in China and in mainland Southeast Asia. They predict in the 21st century, where the war mainly were related to water, the war between the states. Okay. Their argument is very related to the concept of zero-sum game, which is if the country develop the hydropower dam in the upstream to Mekong River, for example, China, and because the water is a limited resource, it's essential for the people, that will have the negative and environmental and social impact to the people who live in the downstream. And so a country in the downstream has the right to use the water. So it is likely for the country in the downstream to use many methods they can to fight back the right to use the water. Okay, is that true? And this is the one issue that I would like to discuss in our discussion group. It's true, because if you look at mainland Southeast Asia right now, even there's so many hydropower dams in China, in mainland Southeast Asia, but it's no peace, it's no conflict in the mainland Southeast Asia. But that doesn't mean there's no conflict between what Ajahn Chiang and Carl mentioned, which is the people or the actors who are excluded in the decision-making process of the hydropower dam and who support the hydropower dam. Okay, so this will be the main issue that we want to discuss. And also that if you look at the transboundary of the Mekong River management, that you can see there's a very interesting point is there's no conflict between each other's, the riparian state is because China are the main investors in mainland Southeast Asia, many hydropower dams, for example, in Cambodia, the Lower Sen Sang too. And Thailand as well. Okay, in the late 1980s, actually in 1950, that Thai government, because it needed electricity, created hydropower dam. But in the late 1980s, because of Pamu Dam, that many villagers against the dam. So the Thai government ceased the creation of the dam and put the target in the neighboring country, Laos and Myanmar. And Ajahn Chang just mentioned that the Xayaburi Dam, which is a very controversial dam in Laos. This dam is invested by EGAT, which is the state-owned electricity company in Thailand. And when EGAT invested in this dam was financially supported by many big banks in Thailand. Okay, not only Xayaburi Dam and also the Nam Tung 2 Dam in Laos as well. And as Ajahn Carl mentioned, is the very tricky thing is over 90% of the electricity of these big hydropower dams export to Thailand. Okay, also the one that will create in Myanmar, the Haiji Dam. The majority of the electricity generation will export to Thailand as well. But the negative impact will mainly left in Laos and in Myanmar. And that's also linked to the economic development in Thailand as well. The papers study the Nantum dams. And the very interesting thing is that the scholars' paper showed the transmission electricity lines in Bangkok. The Nam Tung Dam actually it's the electricity delivered to the Thailand. And Thailand, do you know the Bangkok has the very popular shopping mall called Paragon, right? Yeah, it's Paragon. And the electricity consumption in this shopping mall is 2 times over Mae Hong Son. Mae Hong Son is the town. And yeah, and it's exactly the same, the electricity consumption, exactly the same. There's a province called Mudahan, which is at the border between Thailand and Laos. Okay, so can you imagine that the negative impact left in Laos and in Myanmar? But the Laos and the Myanmar government still agree, and also they export the electricity. Of course, we know that Laos want to become the factory of Southeast Asia. That's why they want to make the revenue, the national revenue. But the main issue is the politics in Laos is not transparent, which means that we don't know whether the Laos evenly distributes the benefit from the hydropower dam to all the Laos people. Okay, so my final conclusion is if you look at these 2 issues, and to connect to the transboundary rivers management in mainland Southeast Asia. The conclusion will be quite interesting is that the rivers shared by Thailand and Laos and shared by Thailand and Myanmar, the rivers are basically mainly managed and invaded by Thailand, but not Laos and Myanmar, their own. Thank you very much.
We still have some time, so we would like to invite some questions before we take a break, before we take a coffee break. Any question? Someone would like to add more comments to the speakers? If not, we can also do it in the small group discussion.
Maybe we need to fix the groups as well. For
Yes,
this
yes. Yes, please, Professor.
Yeah. If there is time,
Yes.
I have an idea how we could connect these talks, which were mainly, not solely, but mainly on macro issues or on transboundary issues, transnational issues, connect to our field trips. And I think if we are talking about field trips, what is in social science conceived as field is not the spatial area, but it's a social field. And by definition, if you see a social field, it's a field of connected persons who know each other in a way. So by definition, it's micro-oriented. And now the question, if we have so many influences from global up to global scales, we have local, translocal, national, supranational, supranational, up to global. The question is, in our field trips, we have so many potential influences from outside, from these levels, and vice versa, so many effects of the local situations to trans-local situations. And if we want to get it out empirically, the question for our teams in the field sites would be, how can we do this in some days? So many potential connections. And I think the simple way we could approach to that is to start with the living conditions of the people where we live there in the homestay situations or similar situations, and ask ourselves and ask the people and interrogate with the people, what is the largest frame of influences which you know comes to you, or you feel, or you experience, which has an effect to your local situation, and vice versa, what are the highest level of effects you know from your village up to the larger system. So in order to connect it. And there is one author, one of the publications here listed in the list is about progressive contextualization, and that's precisely the concept in human equality or political equality, how to approach this question of macro link in an empirical way, starting from the micro. That's what we start.
For your comments, and I think the group that will visit Chiang will learn from the villagers of how they see the macro level impacts upon their livelihood. I think they'll talk about that. Not only the impacts upon their own livelihood, but also how such the macro ecological change have reduced the relationship between themselves and other villages across the border as well. Any more question? Okay. Mike?
Maybe one comment on your last remark that the Mekong is basically managed by Thailand. I guess when we talk about transboundary flows like the Mekong, it also transcends actually regions. And you could also argue that the Mekong is basically managed by China and
Yes.
and the many dams that are already built there.
Yeah.
So I mean, like, yeah. So it crosses basically also areas, not just like countries.
But yes.
Yeah, agreed. Agreed that China is also the main investor in Laos. I mean, hydropower dams.
Yeah, all the dams in China already. No?
Yeah.
Okay, so no more questions. So if not, we will take a break. Michelle? So please give a hand to the speakers.
Larger plantations, land concessions. So we'll be looking at these issues through a stakeholder perspective.
Thank you. Ajahn Chayan, may I, or? Okay, Carl, may I ask you to quickly explain?
Yes, okay. So for the Transnational Environmental Justice Group, one thing is that we can follow up on any of the issues that I presented. I also gave a reading that maybe you haven't read, but we can discuss, which is looking at the relationship between civil society and national human rights institutions as sort of countervailing political authority to try and seek justice. And so we could discuss the paper, we could discuss these themes, but also broader questions could be, what is justice and how do we research it? And in particular through the transdisciplinary lens. So how could you integrate it into your field research? What types of processes and institutions should we be looking at, and arenas? And what is the role of civil society and local movements, including their strengths, potentials, and challenges? And then the last question would be, what are the challenges of regionalization in the very uneven landscape that we see in the region?
My part will focus on the water wars. It's not only between the mainland Southeast Asia countries, but also between the countries and the people, and all the countries and the civil society. So what expects to everyone to discuss in this is to contribute your the background, what you studied before. Maybe you will have the different perspective about these issues. Yeah.
The group discussion that I will lead is on refugees along the Thai-Burma border. But I also welcome participants who knows about refugees in your country, in Australia or Germany or other countries, how we can compare the situation between refugees in Europe and refugees in South Asia. I also would like to follow the suggestion by Professor Hans Weiler that we cannot look only the macro level in the policy, but also look at what happened in the camp, the livelihood of the refugees in the camps along the border. My colleague, Dr. Mali, and I have visited several camps there, and perhaps we can share some information about that. And then how can we discuss about how to do a research on the refugees issues, maybe not from the international human rights issue, but also on a kind of a refugees as agency, for example.